Section 10 of Diary of a U-Boat Commander. I have just had to stop recording my experiences of the past 48 hours, as the navigator, who is on watch, sent down a message to say that smoke was in sight. The next hour was full of anxiety, but by hauling off to port we managed to lose it. I then had a little food, and I will now conclude my account before trying again to get some sleep. New entry. The account continued. All my hopes of getting up again that night, both for the purpose of charging and getting the 3 a.m. signal, were doomed to be disappointed, as the hydrophone operator kept on reporting the noise of destroyers overhead. Occasional distant thuds seemed to indicate a never-ending supply of depth charges, but they were about 4 or 5 miles from me. Perhaps some other unfortunate devil was going through the fires of hell. At daylight on the second day my position was still miserable. The battery was getting low again, the sea had gone down, and when I put my periscope up at 9 a.m., the horizon seemed to be ringed with patrols. I felt as if I was in an invisible net, and though I endeavoured to conceal my apprehension from the crew, I could see from the listless way they went about their duties that they realized that once again we were near the end of our resources. All the forenoon we crept along at 30 meters, until the tension was broken at 1 p.m. by a furious depth-charge attack. In some extraordinary way they had located me again, and closed in upon me. The first charges were some little distance off, and as they got closer a feeling of desperation overcame me, and I seriously contemplated ending the agony by surfacing and fighting to the last with my gun. Curiously enough, the procedure that I adopted was the exact opposite. I decided to dive deep. I went down to 114 meters. At this exceptional depth, 3 rivets in the pressure hole began to leak, and jets of water with the rigidity of bars of iron shot into the boat. I held on for 5 minutes, which was sufficient to save me from the depth-charge attack, though 2 which went off almost above me broke some lamps. I then came up to 20 meters and slowly crawled on. Throughout the long afternoon, though we were not directly attacked again, I heard depth charges on several occasions, sufficiently close to me to demonstrate that these implacable and tireless devils had an idea of the area I was in. By a supreme effort, working one motor at the only speed it would go, dead slow, I managed to squeeze out the battery until I estimated it must be dusk. There was only one thing to do. I surfaced. It was not as dark as I had hoped, and I saw a fairly large sloop-like vessel about 8,000 meters away on the port beam. She must have seen me simultaneously, as the flash of a gun darted from her, the shell falling short. I couldn't dive. There seemed only one thing to do: fight and then die. I ordered the gun's crew up, and the unequal duel began. We were going full speed on the diesels, and my course was east by north. A good deal of water and spray was flying over the gun, and my crew had little hope of doing much accurate shooting, but I have often found that when one is being fired at there is nothing so comforting as the sound of one's own gun. Our enemy was armed with 2 large guns, 15 centimeters or over, but had no speed, a discovery which raised my hopes again. It was soon evident that, provided we were not heading for another patrol, if we could survive 10 minutes shelling, we should be saved for the time being by the fading light, which was evidently causing our enemy increasing difficulties, as his shots alternated between very short and very much over. I was actually congratulating the navigator on our escape, and I had just told the gun's crew to cease firing at the blurred outlines on the port quarter from which the random shells still came, when there was a sheet of yellow flame and a jar which threw me against the signalman. The latter had been standing near the conning tower hatch, and unfortunately I knocked him off his balance, and he fell with a thud into the upper conning tower. He had the good fortune to escape with a couple of ribs broken, but when I recovered myself and got to my feet, far worse consequences met my eyes. By the worst of ill luck, a shell which must have been fired practically at random had hit the gun just below the port trunnion. The result of the explosion was very severe. 4 of the 7 men at the gun had been blown overboard. The breech worker was uninjured, though from the way he swayed about it was evident that he was dazed, and I expected to see him fall over the side at any moment. The remaining 2 men were as dead as horseflesh. The material damage was even more serious. The gun had been practically thrown out of its cradle, but in the main the trunnion blocks had held firm, and the whole pedestal had been carried over to starboard. The really terrible effects of this injury were not apparent at first sight, but I soon realized them, for an hour later we had shaken off the sloop. I saw a red flame on the horizon, which plainly indicated flaming at the funnel from some destroyer, doubtless looking for us at high speed. I dived, intending to surface again as soon as possible. With this intention in my head, I did not go below the upper conning tower. We had barely got to 10 meters, when loud cries from below and the disquieting noise of rushing water told me that something was wrong. I blew all tanks, surfaced, left the first lieutenant on watch, and went below. There were 5 centimeters of water on the battery boards, and I understood at once that we could never dive again. For the pedestal of the gun, in being forced over, had strained the longitudinal seam of the pressure hole to which it is bolted, and a shower of water had come through as soon as we got under. It might have been hoped that this was enough, but no, our cup was not yet full. Chlorine gas suddenly began to fill the fore end. The salt water running down into the battery tanks had found acid, and though I ordered quantities of soda to be put down into the tank, it became, and still is at the moment of writing, impossible to move forward of the conning tower without putting on a gas mask and oxygen helmet. So we are helpless, and at the mercy of any little trawler, or even the weather. We have no gun. We cannot dive. The English must know that they have hit us, and every hour I expect to see the hull of a destroyer climb over the horizon astern. We are fortunate in 2 respects, in that for the time being the weather seems to promise well, and our diesels are thoroughly sound. We are ordered to Zeebrugge. I could have wished elsewhere for many reasons, but it does not matter, as I cannot believe we are intended to escape. I feel I would almost welcome an enemy ship. It would soon be over. But this uncertainty and anxiety drags on for hour after hour, and now I cannot sleep, though I haven't slept properly for over 70 hours. I am so worn out that my body screams for sleep, but it is denied to me, and so, lest I go mad, I write. It is better to do this, though my eyes ache and the letters seem to wriggle, than to stand up on the bridge looking for the smoke of our enemies, or to lie in my bunk and count the revolutions of the diesels, thousands of thudding beats, one after the other, relentless hammer strokes. I haven't endured much. Note by Etienne. A break occurs in Karl von Schenk's diary at this juncture. Fortunately, the main outlines of the story are preserved owing to Zoe's long letter, which was in a small packet inside the cover of the second notebook. Zoe's letter will be reproduced in this book in its proper chronological position, but in order to save the reader the trouble of reading the book from the letter back to this point, a brief summary of what took place is given here. The entries in his diary which follow the words, "I have endured much," are very meagre for a period which seems to have been about a month in length. There was no further mention of the latter stages of Karl's passage in the wrecked boat to Zeebrugge, so it is presumed that he made that port without further adventure. He was evidently on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and appears to have been suffering from very severe insomnia. He had been hunted for 2 days, during which he was perpetually on the verge of destruction, and the cumulative effect of such an experience is bound to leave its mark on the strongest man. When he got back to Zeebrugge he must have been at the end of his tether, and whether by chance or design it was when Karl was, as he would have said, at a low mental ebb, that Zoe made her last and successful attack upon his resolution not to see her again unless she consented to marry him. It is plain from her letter that when he left her after the stormy interview in which he vowed never to see her again, Zoe did not lose hope. She seems to have kept herself au courant with his movements, and actually to have known when he was expected in. We know that she had many friends amongst the officers, and it is probable that from one of these she was able to get information about Karl's movements. Bruges was probably a hotbed of U-boat gossip, and, not unlike the conditions at certain other naval ports during the war, the ladies were often too well informed. At any rate, it appears that Zoe rushed to see Karl directly he arrived at Bruges, and found him a mental and physical wreck, suffering from acute insomnia. With the impetuous vigor which evidently guided most of her actions, she took complete charge of Karl, and as he was due for 4 days' leave, she whisked him off to the forest. Karl may have protested, but was probably in no state to wish to do so. At her shooting box in the forest, Zoe achieved her desire, and the stubborn struggle between the lovers ended in victory for the woman. There is an entry in Karl's diary which may refer to this period. He simply says, "Slept at last. Oh, what a joy!" If this entry was written in the forest, it seems as if Karl had been unable to sleep until Zoe carried him off to the forest peace of her shooting box, and surrounded him with the atmosphere of her tender sympathy. There is no evidence of the light in which Karl viewed his defeat, when, having regained his strength, he was able to take stock of the changed situation. It is reasonable to suppose that his silence upon this matter in the pages of his diary is evidence that he was ashamed of what he must have considered a great act of weakness on his part. At all events, he realized that he had crossed the Rubicon and that he had better acquiesce in the fait accompli. He seems to have been in the harbor for about 6 weeks, during which he lived with Zoe, and the lovers enjoyed a brief spell of happiness before Karl set out on his next trip. Karl seems to have found those 6 weeks very pleasant ones, though his diary merely contains brief references, such as "A day in the country with Z." Z and I went to the cavalry dance, and other trivial entries. Of his thoughts there is not a word. About the end of 1917 Karl's boat was repaired, and he left for the Atlantic, and once more resumed full entries in his diary. Signed, Etienne. Karl's diary resumed. Sailed at 9 p.m. last night, and we are now 17 miles off Beachy Head. The Straits of Dover were frightful. The glare of the acetylene flares on the barrage showed for miles. Seen from a distance, it gave me the impression of the gates of hell, through which we had to pass. I dived 10 miles away, and went through with the tide at a depth of 40 meters. 2 hours and 3/4 of suspense, and at dawn we came up, having passed safely through the great death trap. At the moment there is nothing in sight, except a little smoke on the horizon. I am going to dive again until dusk. New entry, 2 a.m. We are thrashing down the channel with a southwesterly wind right ahead. My instructions are to work for 2 days between the Lizard and Kinsale Head, and then proceed far out into the Atlantic, where the convoys are supposed to meet the destroyers. That Fair Island Channel experience was enough for a lifetime. Death, quick, short, and sudden, this I am ready for. But torture, slow, long, and drawn out, is not in the bargain which in this year of grace every civilized man and half the savages of the world seem to have had to make with the god Mars. As I sit in this steel, cigar-shaped mass of machinery, the question rings incessantly in my ears. To what object is all this war directed, when analyzed from the point of view of the individual? It does not satisfy any longing of mine. I have not got a lust for battle. No one who fights has a lust for battle. Editors of newspapers and people on general staffs, possibly also cabinet ministers, have lust for battles, as long as they arrange the battle and talk about it afterwards. Curse them. The only thing I want is to be with Zoe. I want to live and spend long years with her, enjoying life, this life of which I have spent half already, and now perhaps it will be taken from me by some other man. some Englishman, who doesn't really want to take my life, reckoned as an individual. Around me in the darkness are the patrol boats, manned by the Englishmen who are seeking my life. Seeking it, not to gratify their private emotions, but because we are all in the whirlpool of war and cannot escape. Like an avalanche, it seems to gather strength and speed as it rolls on, this war of nations. The world must be mad. I cannot see how it can ever stop. England will never be defeated at sea. We shall conquer on land. Then what? An inconclusive peace. Even if we smash this island empire and gain the dominion of the world, how will it advantage me? I can see no way in which I can gain. It would be said, if any one should read this, Gott! What a selfish point of view. He thinks only of his personal gain, not of his country. But confound it all, I reply, answer me this. Do I exist for my country, or does my country exist for me? For example, does man live for the sake of the Church, or was the Church created for man? Does not my country exist for my benefit? Surely it is so. Then again, I am risking my all, my life. I live in danger, apprehension, and great discomfort. I do all these things, and yet if as a reasonable man I ponder what advantage I am to gain from all these sacrifices, I am adjudged selfish. It is all madness. I cannot fathom the meaning of these things. New entry. In position on the Bristol line of approach. The weather is bad. New entry. At 20 meters. Once again death has stretched forth his bony fingers to catch me by the throat, and only by a chance have I wriggled free. Yesterday afternoon at 5 p.m. we sighted a small steamer flying Spanish colors and steering for Cardiff. The weather was choppy, but not too bad, and I decided to exercise the gun's crew, though I did not think there would be much doing, as the Spaniards soon give in. I opened fire at 6,000 meters, and pitched a shell ahead of her and ran up the signal to heave to. The wretched little craft paid no attention, and continued on her lumbering course. I suspected the presence of an Englishman on her bridge, and determined to hit. This we did with our 6th shot, and she stopped dead and wallowed in the trough, with clouds of steam pouring out of her engine room. We had evidently got the engine room. As we closed her, it was evident that a tremendous panic was taking place on board. The port sea boat was being launched, but one fall broke and the occupants fell into the water. My navigator begged me to give her another, which I did, and hit her right aft. 2 boatloads of gesticulating individuals now appeared from the shelter of her lee side, and began pulling wildly away from the ship. The navigator, whose eyes were dancing with excitement, was very keen to play with them by spraying the water with machine-gun bullets, but it seemed to me to be waste of ammunition, and I would not permit it. Meanwhile we had approached to within about 400 meters of her port bow. I was debating whether to accelerate her sinking, when I noticed that a fire had broken out aft, and I became possessed with a childish curiosity to see the fire being put out as she sank. It was a kind of contest between the elements. As I watched her, I was startled to hear 3 or 4 reports from the region of the fire. "Ammunition!" shouted the pilot with wide-opened eyes. In an instant I pressed the diving alarm, as I realized our deadly peril. Fool that I had been, she was a decoy ship. She must have realized on board that I had seen through their disguise, for as we began to move forward, under the motors, a trap-door near her bows fell down. The white ensign was broken at the fore, and a 4-inch gun opened fire from the embrasure that was revealed on her side. We were fortunate in that our conning tower was already right ahead of the enemy, and as I dropped down into the conning tower, I saw that as she could not turn we were safe. A few shells plunged harmlessly into the water near our stern, and then we were under. We came up to a periscope depth, and I surveyed her from a position off her stern. She was sinking fast, but I felt so furious at being nearly trapped that I could not resist giving her a torpedo. Detonation was complete, and a mass of wreckage shot into the air as the hull of the ship disappeared. As to the 2 boats, I left them to make the best course to land that they could. As they were 50 miles off the shore when I left them, and it blew force 6 a few hours afterwards, I rather think they have joined the list of missing. We are now steering due west to our second position. New entry. Received orders last night to return to base forthwith on the north about route. Footnote. This means into the North Sea round Scotland. End of footnote. I have shaped course to pass 50 miles north of Muckleflugga. No more Fair Island Channel for me. New entry. Statlandlet in sight, with the Norwegian coast looking very lovely under the snow. We never saw a ship from north of the Shetlands to this place, when we saw a light cruiser of the Town class steaming southwest at high speed. She had probably been on patrol off this place, where the inner and outer leads join up, and ships have to leave the 3-mile limit. She was well away from me, and an attack would have been useless. I did not shed any tears. I have lost much of the fire-eating ideas which filled my mind when I first joined this service. New entry. We are due off the Mole at 8 p.m. tonight, and my heart leaps with joy at the thought of seeing my Zoe. Already I can almost imagine her lovely arms round my neck, her face raised to mine, and all the other wonderful things that make her so glorious in my eyes. Section 11 of Diary of a U-Boat Commander. Note by Etienne. Before quoting the next entry in Karl's journal, it is necessary to explain the situation which confronted him when he arrived in Zeebrugge. In his absence, his beloved Zoe had been arrested as an Allied agent, and she was tried for espionage within a day or 2 of his arrival. There is no record of how he heard the news, and the blow he sustained was probably so terrible that whilst there was yet hope, he felt no desire to write. But, as will be seen, there came a time when he turned to his journal as the last friend that remained to him. It is a curious fact that, with the exception of an entry at the beginning of this journal, Karl makes little mention of his mother and home at Frankfurt. Though he does not say so, it seems possible that his mother had heard of his entanglement with Zoe, and a barrier had risen between them. This suggestion gains strength from the fact that in his blackest moments of despair he never seems to consider the question of turning to Frankfurt for sympathy. Interest is naturally aroused as to the details of Zoe's trial. The available material consists solely of the long letter she wrote to him from Bruges jail. It may be that one day the German archives of the period of occupation will reveal further details. Information on the subject is possibly at the disposal of the British Intelligence Service, but this would be kept secret. All we know on the matter is derived from the letter, which has been preserved inside the 2nd volume of Karl's diary. There seems no doubt that she was caught red-handed, but to say more would be to anticipate her own words. It was a matter of some difficulty to know where best to introduce Zoe's letter, but with a view to securing as much continuity of thought in the story as possible, it has been decided to quote it at this juncture, although he did not receive it until after he had made the entry in the journal, which will be quoted directly after the letter. I would like to appeal to any reader who may happen to be engaged in administrative or reconstructive work in Belgium to communicate with me, care of Messrs. Hutchinson, should he handle any papers dealing with Zoe's trial. Etienne. Zoe's letter. My best beloved, when you get this letter, cease to sorrow for what will have happened, for I shall be at rest, and in peace at last, freed from a world in which I have known bitter sorrow and, until you came into my life, but little joy. For these past months I am grateful to God, if such a being exists and regulates the conduct of a world gone mad. For in a few hours I am to die. It is harder for you than for me. One moment of agony I suffered, a moment that seemed to last a century,
when, amidst the sea of faces that swam in a confused mass before me at the trial, I saw your eyes and the torture that you were suffering. When I saw your eyes I knew that the President had said I must die. I am glad that I was told this by you, the only one amongst all these men who love me. I suppose the President spoke. I never heard him, but I saw your eyes, and I knew. My darling, it was cruel of you to come, cruel to me, and cruel to yourself, but I loved you for being there. It showed me that up till the last you would stand by me, and until you read this you cannot know all the facts. That to you, as to the others, I must have seemed a woman's spy, and that nevertheless you stood by me, is to me a recollection of unsurpassable sweetness, compared with which all other thoughts of you fade into insignificance. Know now, O well-beloved, that I was not unworthy of your love. I have a story to tell you, and I have such a little time left that I must write quickly. The priest who has been with me comes again an hour before the dawn, and he has promised to deliver these my last words of love into your hands. My real name is Zoe Xenia Olga Spilitz, and I was born 29 years ago at my father's country house at Inkovano, near Koniesfol. I am Polish, at least my father was, and my mother comes from the Don country. There was a day when my father's ancestors were princes in Poland. Poor Poland was torn by the vultures of Europe, just as your countrymen, my Karl, are tearing poor Belgium and France, and so my family lost estates year by year, and my grandfather is buried somewhere in the dreary steppes of Siberia, because he dared to be a Polish patriot. My father bowed before the storm, and under my mother's influence he never became mixed up with politics. Thus he lived on his estates at Inkovano, and nursed them for my younger brother, Alexandrovitch, the child of his old age. Alex would be 19 now, had he lived. The estates were large as these things go in Western Europe, but they were but a garden as compared with the lands held by my great-grandfather, Boris Sibylitz. My father had a dream, and he dreamed this dream from the day Alex was born to the day they both died in each other's arms. My father dreamt that one day the Tsars would soften their heart to Poland, and raise her up from the dust to a place amongst the nations, and my father dreamt that Alexandrovitch Sibylitz would become a leader of Poland, as his ancestors had been before him. And so my father nursed his estates, and pinched and saved, in preparation for the day when his beautiful dream should come true. My poor idealistic father never realized, oh my Karl, that when one wants a thing, one must fight to the death. Alex was the apple of his eye, but I was much loved by my mother. Perhaps she dreamed a dream about me, I know not, but she determined that I should have all that was necessary. Paris, Berlin, Munich, Dresden, and a season in London. Then I came home at 21. Perfectly educated according to the world, beautiful according to men, and dressed according to Paris. But I was only to find out how little I knew. My mother and I used to take a house in Warsaw for the season, and I met many notable men and women. In these days I, also, thought I could do something for Poland, but after 2 or 3 seasons I found that I, too, was only dreaming idle dreams. Oh, my beloved, beware of dreaming idle dreams. Listen, I once met the Prime Minister of all Russia at a reception. I captivated him, and thought, now I shall do something. I sat next to him at dinner. I talked of Poland, and I knew my subject. I talked brilliantly. He listened, he hung on my words, and he, the Prime Minister of all Russia, the Tsar's right-hand man, asked me to drive with him next day in his sledge. I, an almost unknown Polish girl. When I accepted, I was in the seventh heaven of delight. Next day he called and we set forth. At a deserted spot in the woods near Warsaw he tried to kiss me. I struck him in the face with the butt of his own whip. That was why he had hung on my words, and that was why he had taken me for my drive. It was my Polish body that interested him, not Poland. The Prime Minister of Russia was confined to his room for 2 days, owing to an indisposition. How I laughed when I saw the bulletin in the paper, signed by 2 doctors, but it taught me a lesson. I never dreamt idle dreams again. No, I am wrong, my beloved. I dreamt an idle dream, a lovely dream about you and I. An after-the-war dream, if this war should ever end, but like other dreams it has ended, in dreams. But I must hurry, for my little watch tells me that 1 hour of my 5 is gone, and I have much to say. I could have married, and married brilliantly, but Poland held me back. I did not know what I could do for my country. It all seemed so hopeless, and yet I felt that perhaps one day, and I felt I ought to be single when that day came. It was not easy, my Karl. Sometimes it was hard. One man there was, Sergius was his Christian name. He loved me madly, and sometimes I thought... But no matter, he is dead now, killed at Tannenberg, and well, I will tell you more of my story. When the war broke out and clouded over that last beautiful summer in 1914, I wonder will there ever be another like it in your lifetime, my Karl. No, I don't think it can ever be quite the same after all this. We were all in the country. Alex was back from his school in Petrograd, and my father kept him at home for the autumn term. How well I remember the excitement, the mobilization, the blessing of the colours, the wave of patriotism which swept over the country. Even I, under the influence of the specious proclamations that were issued broadcast by the government, with their promises of reform and redress for Poland after the war was over, felt more Russian than Polish. Lies, 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 that was what the government promises were, my Karl. Under the stress of war, the rottenness of that great white sepulchre, Russia, feared the revival of the Polish spirit. It might have been awkward, and so they lied with their tongues in their cheeks, and we simple Poles believed them. The peasantry flocked to their depots, little knowing whom they fought, but the proclamations which were read to them told them they fought for Poland, and we women worked and prayed for the success of Russian arms. Then the tide of war swept westward, and all day long and every day the troops and the guns and the motor cars and the wagons rolled through the village to the west. Guarded hints in the papers seemed to say that all was not well in France, but France was so far away, and all the time the Russians were going west through our village. Mighty Russia was putting forth her strength, and the Austrian debacle was in full swing. These were great days, my Karl, for a Russian. Then, one day, the long columns of men and all the traffic seemed to hesitate in the sluggish westward flow, and then it stopped, and then it began to go east. The weeks went on, and one day, very, very faintly, there was a rumbling like a distant thunderstorm. It was the guns. The front was coming back. Have you ever seen forest fires, my Karl? We had them every autumn in our woods. If you have, then you know how all the small animals and the birds, the rabbits and the foxes, and perhaps a wolf or two, and the deer, and the thrushes and the linnets come out from the shelter of the trees, fleeing blindly from the great peril, anxious only to save their lives. So it was when the front came back. Herds of moujiks, the old men, the women, the children, the poor little babies, struggled blindly eastwards through the village, pushing their miserable household goods on handcarts, or staggering along with loads on their backs, and weary children dragging at their arms, the human tide flowed eastwards round our house, begged perhaps a drink of water, and then wandered feverishly onwards. They knew not, in 99 cases out of 100, where they were going. Their only destination was summed up in the words, "Away from the front," away from the ominous rumbling which began to get louder, away from that western horizon which was beginning to have a lurid glow at nights, like a sunset prolonged to dawn. Then, as the Germans advanced more and more, the character of the tide changed. The civilian element was outnumbered by the military. Companies, battalions, brigades, sometimes in good order, sometimes in no order, marched through the village. They would often halt for a short time, and the officers would come up to the house, where my mother and I gave them what we could. My father lived amongst his books and accounts, and bemoaned the extravagance of the war. Then there were the deserters, the stragglers, the walking wounded, but you know, my Karl, what an army in retreat means. I must proceed with my story, for time moves relentlessly on. One day, a desperately wounded officer, a young lieutenant of the guard, a boy of 25, was taken out of a motor ambulance to die. The ambulance had stopped opposite our gates, and lying on his stretcher he had seen our garden, my garden. He knew he was to die, and he had begged with tears in his eyes to the doctor that he might be left in the garden. Who could refuse him? He died within 2 hours, amongst our flowers, with Alex and I at his side. Before he died he begged us, implored us, almost ordered us, to move east before it was too late. We repeated his arguments to my father, but the latter was obdurate, and he swore that a regiment of angels would not move him from his ancestral home. So we made up our minds to stay. Things got worse and worse, and one day shells fell in the grounds and we hid in the cellars. That night all our servants ran away, and my father cursed them for cowards. Next day in the early morning we heard machine guns fire outside the village, and then all was still. At 6 o'clock Alex, white-faced, came running into the house. He had been down to the gates and he had seen the enemy. They were drunk, he said, and going down the street firing the houses and shooting the people as they came out. It seemed impossible, and yet it was true. It was growing dark when we heard shouts and saw lights, and from the top of the house I saw a crowd of singing and shouting soldiers with pine torches, half running, half walking up the drive. They massed in a body opposite the house. Paralyzed with terror, I looked down on the scene and shuddered to see that every second man seemed to have a bottle. One of them fired a shot at the house, and next I remember a flood of light on the drive, and in the circle of light my father standing with hand raised. What my father intended could never be known, for, as he paused and faced the mob, a solitary shot rang out, and he fell in a huddled heap. As he fell, a boyish voice from the door shouted, "Murderers!" It was Alex. With his little pistol I had given him for a birthday present in his hand, he ran forward, and standing over my father's body, head thrown back, he pointed his pistol at the mob and fired twice. A man dropped, there was a flash of steel, the crowd surged forward, and oh, my Karl, they had murdered my beloved brother, my darling Alex. The next moment they were in the house. I escaped from my window onto the roof of the dairy, and from there down a water pipe, across the yard to an old hayloft. For a long time they ran in and out of the house, like ants, looting and pillaging. Then there was a great shout, and for some time not a soul came out of the house. I guessed they had got into the cellars. At about midnight I saw that the house was on fire. In a few minutes it was an inferno, and the drunken soldiers came pouring out, firing their rifles in all directions. I had found a piece of rope in the loft. One end I placed on a hook, and the other round my neck. I was close to the upper doors of the loft, with a drop to the courtyard, and thus I stayed, for I feared that some soldier, more sober than the rest, might explore the outhouses and find me. I was watching this unearthly spectacle, and never, my best beloved, did I conceive that man could become lower than the beasts. But before my eyes it was so, when I noticed that the great gates at the southern end of the courtyard were opening. As they opened I saw that beyond them was drawn up a line of men. An officer gave an order, and 2 machine guns were placed in position at the gate entrance. Round the guns lay their crews, and the seething mass of revellers saw nothing. I felt that a fearful tragedy was impending, and as I held my breath with anxiety, the officer gave a short, sharp movement with his hand, and a hideous rattle rose above all noises. The pandemonium that ensued was indescribable. Some ran helplessly into the burning house. Others ran round and round in circles. Others tried to get into the dairy. One man got upon its roof and fell back dead as soon as his head appeared above the outer wall. The place was surrounded. It was horrible. A few tried to rush for the gate. They melted away like snow before the sun, as their bodies met the pitiless stream of bullets. I suppose 200 men were killed in as many seconds. The machine guns ceased fire. Ambulance parties came into the yard, collected the dead and living, and within half an hour there was not a soul save myself in the place. Discipline had received its oblation of men's lives. As an example, it was one of the most wonderful things I have ever known in your wonderful army, my Karl, but it was terrible, terribly cruel. I never knew what became of my mother, though I feel she is dead, murdered perhaps like my father and my darling Alex, or perhaps she hid somewhere in the house and remained petrified with terror till the flames came. Next morning I left my hiding place and walked about. Not a German was to be seen, but in the wood was a huge, newly made grave. It was all open warfare then, and this flying column, which was miles in advance of the main body, had moved on. The house was a smoking mass of ruins, but the farm buildings had been spared, and I let out all the poor animals and turned them into the woods, so that they might have their chance. All day I searched for my father and brother, but not a sign was to be seen, and at dusk I stood alone, faint and broken, amongst the ruins of my ancestors' home. As I looked at the scene of desolation and I contrasted what had been my life 24 hours before and what it was then, something seemed to snap in my brain, and for the first time I cried. Oh, the blessed relief of those tears, my Karl, for I was a poor, weak, helpless girl, and alone with death and bitterness all round me. Late that night I hid once more in my hayloft, and next morning I left Inkovano forever. Before I left I made a vow. It is because of this vow, my beloved, that I am to die. For I vowed by the body of our Saviour, and the murdered bodies of my family, that whilst life was in me and the war was maintained, for so long would I work unceasingly for the Allies against Germany. As the war ran its fiery course, I have seen more and more that the Allies are the only ones who will do anything for Poland, my beloved country. So have I been strengthened in my vow. I struck south on my feet, as a poor girl, I, the daughter of a princely family of Poland. No hardships were too great for me, provided I could reach Allied territory. I travelled from village to village as a singing girl, and once I was driven away with stones by villagers set upon me by a fanatical priest. I came by Cracow and across the Carpathians, helped to pass the lines by a Hungarian lieutenant, but I tricked him of his reward. I was not ready for that sacrifice. Then across the Hungarian plains to Budapest, where I remained 3 weeks, singing in a third-rate café, to make some money for my next stage. But I had to leave too soon. The old story. This time it was the proprietor's son. What beasts men are, my Karl! And yet to me you were above all other men, a prince amongst your fellows, and never did I love you so distractedly as that first night at the shooting box, when I read the scorn in your eyes as you rejected me. I have no shame in telling you this. Am I not already in the grave? And then I must be silent, and can only await your coming. After many struggles, wearisome to relate, I came to Hermannstadt, and there, whilst pushing my trade as a dancer, came into touch with a Hungarian band of smugglers working across the mountain passes between eastern Hungary and Roumania. I did certain work for these men, and in return crossed with them one bitter night in a thunderstorm into Roumania. At Bucharest I got a good engagement, and when I had saved 1,000 marks, I bought a passport for 500 and came to Serbia, then staggering beneath the great Austrian offensive. Once again I was in the horrors of a retreat, but I escaped, reaching Valona, and crossed to Brindisi by the aid of a French officer to whom I told my story and who believed me. His name is Pierre Le Montseur, and he lives at Bordeaux. If fortune places him in your power, be kind to him, my Karl, for your Zoe's sake. I came to Rome, and thence to Paris. I stayed here 3 weeks, singing in a cabaret. Whilst here I tried to advance my plans in vain. What could I, a small girl, do for the Allies? The embassy laughed at me, all except one young attaché who tried to make love to me. Then I thought of England. England and her cold, hard islanders, phlegmatic in movements, slow to hate, slow to move, but once roused, they never let go, these islanders. One of their poets has said, "The mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceeding small." That, my Karl, is like England. They are your most terrible enemies, and you know it. Do not be angry with me when you read this. For me it is Poland, for you Germany. Where I am going in a few hours there is no Poland, no Germany, no England, no war. And perhaps no love. You and I, Karl, have loved, too well perchance, but our love was above even the love of countries. God made the love of men and women, then men and women created their countries. I see the future before me, Karl, and I foresee that the struggle will be at the end of all things between England and Germany. One will be in the dust. Thus I crossed to England and was swallowed up in the great city of London. England has always had a corner of her calculating heart for the small nations, and in London there is a Polish organization. I applied there, and one day I was taken to the Foreign Office, and found myself alone with a great Englishman. His name was... No, I promised, and it will not matter to you, for though he gave me my chance, I have no love for him, and he will never be in your power. Even as I write these words, he has probably taken a list from a locked safe and neatly ruled a red line through the name Zoe Sibylitz. I tell you they know everything, these Englishmen. I told him my story, and then he asked me whether I was prepared to do all things for the Allies. I told him I was. He then said that I could go as agent for a back area in Belgium, and my centre would be Bruges. I agreed, and asked him innocently enough how I was to live in Bruges. He looked up from his desk and said, "You will be given facilities to cross the Belgium-Holland frontier as a German singer." "And then?" I asked. "You will go to Bruges and make friends with an army officer. He must be high up on the staff." I guessed what he meant, but hoped against hope, and I said, "How?" I can still see his fish-like face, hair brushed back with scrupulous care, as without a shadow of emotion he looked up, puffed his pipe, and said in a matter-of-fact tones, "You have a pretty face and an excellent figure. Need I say more?" I could have struck him in the face. I was speechless, my mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. I was roused by the level tones again. "Is it too much for Poland?" Oh, the cunning of the man! He knew my weakness. Mechanically I agreed. Certain details were settled, and he pressed a bell. Within 5 minutes I was walking back to my lodgings. Thanks to a marvellous organization, which your police will never discover, my Karl, within 3 weeks I was singing on the Bruges music hall stage, and accepted without question as being what I was not, a German artist from Danzig. The men were soon around me, but I had no use for youngsters with money. I wanted a man with information. At last I found my man, the Colonel. He was on the headquarters staff of the 11th Army, the Army of Occupation in Belgium, when I first met him. Subsequently he went back to regimental work, but by the time he was killed, and to realize what a release that meant for me, you would have had to have lived with him. I had established regular sources of information concerning which I will say no more. Let your country's agents find them, if they can. This must I say for the Colonel. He was a brute and a drunkard, but in his own gross way he loved me, and he licked my boots at my desire, but I had to pay the price. You are a man, and with all your loving sympathy you can but dimly realize what this costs a woman. To me it was a dual sacrifice of honor and life, but it was for Poland, and the memories of my parents and Alex steeled me and strengthened my resolution, and so, my Karl, I paid the price. My special work was on the military side, and consisted in making quarterly reports on the general dispositions of large bodies of troops, the massing of corps for spring offensives, and big pushes and hammer blows. Then you came into my life. When the Colonel used to go away it was my habit to mix in the demi-mondaine society of Bruges, to try and live a few hours in which I could forget. Oh, don't think the worst. That sort of thing had no attraction for me. I didn't seek oblivion in that direction. I'd never even kissed anyone in Bruges until I kissed you, that first night we met at dinner. I was attracted to you from the very first. The Colonel was due back in a few days, and I suddenly felt mad, and kissed you. I suppose you put me down as one of the usual kind, out to sell myself at a price varying between a good dinner and the rent of a flat. You will now know that I had already mortgaged my body to Poland. Then a few days later you will remember we went down for that wonderful day in the forest, and for the first time, Karl, I began to see that I was really caring for you, and a faint realization of the dangers and impossibilities towards which we were drifting crossed my mind. Do you remember how silent I was on the drive back? In a fashion, my Karl, I could foresee dimly a little of what was going to happen. I had a presentiment that the end would be disaster, but I thrust the idea away from me. Then came the day, just before one of your trips. Oh, the agony, my darling, of those days, each an age in length, when you were at sea, when you told me at the flat that you loved me. How I longed to throw my arms round your neck and abandon myself to your embraces, but I was still strong enough in those days to hold back for both our sakes. Each time we were together I loved you more and more, and each time when you had gone I seemed to see with clearer vision the fatal and inevitable ending. But I refused to give up the first real happiness that had been mine in my short and stormy life, and so I clung desperately to my idle dream. I prayed for hours, Karl, that the war might end, for I felt that in this lay our only hope. But what are one woman's prayers, a sinful woman's prayers, to the Creator of all things, and the war ground on in its endless agony just as it does tonight. Karl, Karl, will this torture ever end? But I must hurry. There is still much to tell you, and time goes on relentlessly just like the war. It is only life that ends. Then came the days I took you to the shooting box for the first time, and that night I broke down and, unashamed, offered you myself. Think not too badly of your Zoe, my Karl. When a woman loves, as I do, what is convention? A nothing, a straw on the waters of life. I wanted you for my own, passionately and desperately, for I feared that any moment the end might come, and to die without having felt your arms around me would have added 1,000 tortures to death, though I could have welcomed death with joy when I saw the look of sorrowful contempt which you cast upon me that night. Heavens above! But you were strong, my Karl. I am not ugly, and yet you resisted, and I hated and loved you at the same time. Oh, I know that sounds impossible, but it isn't for a woman. I slept little that night, and feeling that I could not look you in the face in the morning, I left for Bruges before you got up. I felt that I could trust you not to try and find out the secret of the shooting box. What a relief it is to be able to tell you everything frankly, and how I hated the perpetual game of deception which I had to play. I used to rack my brains for answers to your perpetual question, "Why won't you marry me?" It was a desperate risk taking you down to the forest, but you loved me so much that you never questioned the reasons I gave you for my secrecy. I can tell you now, Karl, that in the early days when I used to disappear from Bruges, it was to the shooting box that I went. But I will write more of that later. Did you suffer the same agony as I did before you left for Kiel, and your pride would not allow you to come to me? You understand now, my darling, why I could never marry you, and when the colonel was killed, it became harder than ever. Once during that terrible interview before you went up the Russian coast, I nearly gave way and promised to marry you. But how could I? I had sworn my vow, and even tonight, though I stand in the shadow of death, I do not regret my vow. It is inconceivable that I could have married you and carried on my work, a spy on my husband's country, and if I ever thought of trying to do this impossible thing, a vision which has partially come true always restrained me. I saw a submarine officer disgraced and perhaps sentenced to death because his wife had been convicted as a spy. No, it was impossible. But if I could not marry you, I still wanted your love. Then you went up the Russian coast, and I heard of your return in a submarine terribly wrecked. I guessed what you must have gone through, and determined to see you, but when I entered your room and saw you lying open-eyed on your bed, with no one but a clumsy soldier to nurse you, I could have wept. You know the rest. You can perhaps hardly remember how I led you to my car, and took you down to the forest. Oh, Karl, are you angry with me for what happened? Do you sometimes think that I took an unfair advantage of your weakness? Please, please forgive me. You were so helpless, and I loved you so. Then came those unforgettable weeks whilst your boat was being repaired. Weeks which opened to me the door of the paradise I was never to enter. Oh, Karl, I pray that all those memories may remain sweet and unclouded all your life. Think of those days when you think of your Zoe. Alas, they came to an end too soon, and you left for the Atlantic. When you came back, all was over. I had been caught at last. The evidence at the trial was clear enough. I have no complaints. I was fairly caught. You remember the big open space in front of the shooting box? I do not mind saying now that 5 times have I been taken up from there in an English aeroplane, and landed there again after 2 days. Each time I took a full report on military affairs. Not a word of naval news, my Karl. You will remember I never tried to find out U-boat information. I even warned you to be cautious. Well, they caught me as I landed. The English boy who had flown me back tried hard to save me, but it only cost him his own life. My first thought was of you, and there is not a jot of evidence against you, save only your friendship for me. Remember this fact, if they persecute you. Admit nothing, believe nothing they tell you, deny everything. They have no evidence, but they are certain to try and trap you. It was noble of you, Karl, to engage Monsieur Labourdin in my defence, but it was useless and may do you harm. I also know of your efforts with the governor. I hoped nothing from him, but what you did has made me ready to die. I tremble lest you are compromised. If only I could feel absolutely certain that I have not dragged you down in my ruin, I should face the rifles with a smile. For my sake, be careful, Karl. When it is all over, cause a few little flowers to cover my resting place, if this is permitted for a spy. Order them. Do not place them yourself. You must not be compromised. I have told my story, and the end is very near. What else is there to say? Mere words are empty husks when I try to express my thoughts of you. Do not sorrow for your Zoe, to whom you have given such happiness. I am not afraid to die and cross into the unknown, which, however terrible it is, cannot be much worse than this awful war. Karl, Karl, how I long to kiss you and feel your strong arms crushing the breath from this body of mine, which has caused so much sorrow. Oh, Mother Mary, support me in this hour of trial. I cannot leave you. May the saints guard you and keep you through all the perils of war, and grant that we meet again in the perfect peace of eternity. Forever, your devoted and adoring Zoe.
Section 12 of Diary of a U-Boat Commander. Karl's diary resumed. She is dead. They have killed her, my Zoe, my adorable darling, and I am still alive, under close arrest. Perhaps they will shoot me too in their insatiable thirst for blood. Oh, if they would! Perhaps, my Zoe, if I could only die and leave this useless world behind, I might find you in the mysterious regions where your spirit now dwells. Oh, is it well with you, Zoe? Give me a sign, a little sign, that all is well. I have knelt in prayer and asked for a sign, but nothing comes. All is a blank, forbidding and mysterious. Is God angry with us, my Zoe, that we have sinned before him? Surely, surely he understands. He must have mercy on me if he is going to make me go on living. If this is my punishment, I can bear it. I will live without you happily, if only I may know that all is well with you.
New entry.
Your letter, Zoe. Can you read these words as I write? Can you sense my thoughts? Speak. Ah! I thought I heard your voice, and it was only the laughter of a woman in the street. Your letter has filled me with joy and sorrow. I read and reread the wonderful words in which you say you loved me from the beginning, but when you plead that I shall not turn in loathing from your memory, with these words you smash me to the ground. Most glorious woman, I never loved you so well and so passionately as the day you stood at the trial, ringed round with the wolves, the clever lawyers, the stolid witnesses, the ponderous books, the cynical air of religious solemnity with which the machinery of the law thinly cloaks its lust for blood, for a life. Even when my ears heard the sentence, I could not believe it would be carried out. The firing party, the chair, the bandage. Oh, God! Spare me these awful thoughts. To think of your breast lacerated by the... Oh, this is unendurable. Stop, madman that I am.
New entry.
I am calmer now. I have read your letter again, and rescued the journal from the grate into which I flung it. The fire was out. I am not sorry. My journal is all I have left, and in its pages are enshrined small, feeble word pictures of paradise on earth. To read them is to catch an echo of the music we both love so well. Music. You were all music to me, my Zoe. Your voice, your movements, your caresses all seemed to me to speak of music. I ask myself, I shall always ask myself until the last hour, whether all that could be done to save you was done. I tried to telegraph to the Kaiser for you, Zoe, but the wire never got further than Bruges post office. They stopped it and put me under arrest. It was only open arrest, my darling, and on that last awful night I forced them to let me see the governor. I, Karl von Schenk, knelt at his feet and begged for your life. He simply said, "You are mad." I left the palace under close arrest. Was ever woman's nobleness of character so exemplified as in your life? Be comforted, Zoe, that in all my black sorrow I cling desperately to my pride and your strength. I long to shout abroad what you did and why you would never marry me, to tell all the gaping world that when you died, a martyr to duty was killed. I am so unworthy of what you did for me, my darling, and it tortures me with mental rendings to think that whilst I prided myself in my strength of mind, I was dragging you through the fires of hell. When I think of those 6 weeks we had together, my brain says, and they might have been months had you not spurned her in the forest. Oh, Zoe, if the priests say truth and all things are now revealed to you, forgive me for this act of mine. Come to me in spirit, and give me mental peace. As I write like this, as if it was a letter that you might read, I am comforted a little. I rely utterly on the hope, which I struggle to change into belief, that you can read this, and know my thoughts. For when I think that had things been otherwise you might have been leaning over my chair at this moment, and running your cool fingers through my stiff hair. When I think of this, my darling, the full realization comes to me of the gulf which must divide us for some uncertain period, and the lines of this page run mistily before my eyes. Zoe, my Zoe, strange things have happened in this war. Wives declare that they have seen their husbands, mothers have felt the presence of their sons. If the powers permit, come to me once again, I implore you, and give me strength to live my life alone. New entry. Examined before the court of inquiry today. Fools! Can't they realize that I don't care if they do shoot me? In the mess, people avoid me. What do I care? Not one of them is worthy to stand on the same soil that holds her beloved body. They have buried her in the castle grounds. In accordance with her wishes, I have arranged for flowers. Perhaps one day, when all this is over, I may be able to live here and tend the place where she sleeps, free at last from all her cares. New entry. At the court of inquiry they tried to cross-examine me on our life together. Dolts! What do they aim at proving? That I loved you? I hardly listened. When they finished the evidence, the President asked me if I had anything to say. Anything to say! I felt like telling them they were cogs in the most monstrous machine for manufacturing sorrow and destruction that mankind had ever devised. I could have shaken my fist in their solemn faces and shouted, "Beasts! You murdered her! You destroyed that most wonderful woman who lowered herself to love me!" Actually, there was a long silence, and then the Vice President, Captain Frühlingsohn, said, "Speak, we wish you well." It was the first touch of sympathy, the only sign of humanity I had received in all those awful days, and it touched my stubborn heart, and the longed-for tears flowed at last. I murmured, "Gentlemen, I am no traitor, but I loved her as my own soul." Dissolve the court. Remove the prisoner. Like the clash of iron gates, officialdom came into its own again. New entry. So, I am not to be shot, not even imprisoned. Don't fall in love with enemy agents again. That summarized their verdict. Ha ha ha! It is all horribly funny. The real reason is that they need me. I am a trained and skillful slaughterer on the seas. I am an essential part of the great machine, and they haven't got any spares. I was in the mess yesterday when the English papers we get from Amsterdam arrived. Oh, a pretty surprise awaited the first man who opened the Times. These English had published the names of 150 U-boat commanders they had caught. There they all were, Christian names and all complete. The only thing missing was a blank space in which to fill in our names when the time comes. Dinner was a silent meal last night, and next morning some rat of a Belgian had posted the list on the gate-post of the mess. The machine has offered 500 marks for his apprehension. How foolish! As if by shooting him they would take any names off the long list. New entry. I am to sail at dawn tomorrow. I shall not be sorry to get away for a space from this place with its mingled memories of delight and death. New entry. Back again, and I haven't written a word for 3 weeks. My billet last trip was off Finisterre. I sighted 2 convoys, but there were destroyers there. They are so black and swift I don't go near them. I don't want to die in a U-boat. It's not worth while. It is easy to avoid these convoys. I dive and make a great fuss of attacking. Then I steer divergently. Nobody knows where the enemy is except me. I am the only one who looks through the periscope. I take good care of that. And then how I curse and swear when I announce that the convoy has altered course, and there is no chance of getting in to attack. None of them are so disappointed as I am. The mines get on my nerves. There is no way of dodging them, and, Lord, how they sprout on the Flanders coast. I am to go out in 6 days. It is very little rest. I believe they want to kill me, but I won't die. Not I. I went to her grave yesterday for the first time. I had thought I should weep, but I did not. In fact, it left me quite unmoved. I feel she's not really dead. She comes to me sometimes, always at night when I am alone, and when we are at sea. There's nothing very tangible, but I catch an echo of her voice in the surge of the sea along the casing, or the sound of the breeze as it plays along the aerial. And so I will not die until she calls me, for up to the present her messages have told me to live and endure. New entry. A very awkward incident took place last night. We were off the Naze and saw a steamer some distance away. We dived to attack. When we were about a mile away I had a look at her, and something about her put me off. I half thought she was a decoy ship, and I privately determined I would not attack. I steered a course which brought me well on her quarter, and as soon as I saw that it was impossible to get into position to fire, I increased speed on the engines and shook the whole boat in efforts which were ostensibly directed to getting her into position. At length I eased speed and bitterly exclaimed that my luck was out. The first lieutenant suggested that we should give her gunfire, but I pointed out that I had good reason to suspect her of being a wolf in sheep's clothing, and as he had not seen her he could hardly question my judgment. I was going forward when I accidentally overheard the navigator and the engineer talking in the wardroom. I listened. The engineer said, "The captain doesn't seem to have the luck he used to command." "Or else he has lost skill," replied Ebert. "We never fired a torpedo at all last trip, and it looks as if we are following that precedent this time." I had heard enough, and without their realizing my presence I returned to the control room. I considered the situation and came to the conclusion that they suspected nothing, but it was evident that their minds were running on lines of thought which might be dangerous. I looked at my watch, and saw that there was still 2 hours of daylight left, and then decided to play a trick on them all. I relieved the first lieutenant at the periscope, and when a decent interval of about half an hour had elapsed, I saw a ship. This vessel of my imagination, a veritable Flying Dutchman, in fact, I proceeded to attack, and after about 20 minutes of frequent alterations of speed and course, I electrified the boat by bringing the bow tubes to the ready. The usual delay was most artistically arranged, and then I fired. With secret amusement I watched the 2 expensive weapons of war rushing along, but destined to sink ingloriously in the ocean, instead of burying themselves in the vitals of a ship. An oath from myself and an order to take the boat to 20 metres. With gloomy countenance I curtly remarked, "The port torpedo broke surface and then dived underneath her. The starboard one missed astern." So far all had gone well, but 10 minutes later I nearly made a fatal error. We had been diving for several hours, the atmosphere was bad, and as it was dusk I decided to come up, ventilate, and put a charge on the batteries. I gave the necessary orders and was on my way up the conning tower to open the outer hatch. The coxswain had just announced that the boat was on the surface when a terrible thought paralysed me, and I clung helplessly to the ladder, trying to think out the situation. It had just occurred to me that as soon as the officers and crew came on deck, they would naturally look for the steamer we had recently fired at. This ship, in the time interval which had elapsed, would still be in sight. As I came down, the first lieutenant was at the periscope, looking round the horizon. Quickly I thrust the youth from the eyepiece, and as calmly as I could said, "I thought I heard propellers." Half an hour later we surfaced for the night. I have been wondering ever since whether they suspect, for the 3 of them were talking in the wardroom after dinner and stopped suddenly when I came in. I must be careful in future. New entry. I was sent for this morning by the Commodore's office, and handed my appointment as senior lieutenant at the barracks Wilhelmshaven. No explanation, though I suspected something of the sort was coming, as 3 days after we got in from my last trip I was examined by the medical board attached to the flotilla. So I am to leave the U-boat service and leave it under a cloud. It is a sad come-down from captain of a U-boat to lieutenant in barracks, a job reserved for the medically unfit for sea service. Am I sorry? No. I think I'm glad. Life here at Bruges is one long painful episode. No one speaks to me in the mess. I am left severely alone with my memories. The night before last I found a revolver in my room, and attached to it was a piece of paper bearing the words, "From a friend." Perhaps at Wilhelmshaven it will be different. And yet, when I went down to the boat at noon and collected my personal affairs, and stepped over her side for the last time, I could not check a feeling of great sadness. We had endured much together, my boat and I, and the parting was hard. New entry. At barracks. As I suspected when I was appointed here, my job is deadly to a degree, and my main duty is to sign leave passes. Our great effort in France has failed, and now the Allies react furiously. The great war machine is strained to its utmost capacity. Can it endure the load? Our proper move is to paralyze the Allied offensive by striking with all our naval weight at his cross-channel communications. The U-boat war is too slow, and time is not on our side, whilst a hammer blow down the channel might do great things. But we have no naval imagination, and who am I that I should advance an opinion? A discredited lieutenant in barracks, that's all. Worse and worse. There are rumours of troubles in the fleet taking place under certain conditions. It is the beginning of the end. Last night the High Seas Fleet were ordered to weigh at 8 a.m. this morning. a mutiny broke out in the König and quickly spread. By 9 a.m. half a dozen ships were flying the red flag. And today Wilhelmshaven is being administered by the Council of Soldiers and Sailors. There has been little disorder. The men have been unanimous in declaring that they would not go to sea for a last useless massacre, a last oblation on the blood-stained altars of war. Can they be blamed? Of what use would such sacrifice be? Yet to an officer, it is all very sad and disheartening. I have seen enough to sicken me of the whole German system of making war, and yet if the call came I know I would gladly go forth and die when tout est perdu for l'honneur. Such instincts are bred deep into the men of families such as mine. We approach the culmination of events. Today Germany has called for an armistice. It has been inevitable since our allies began falling away from us like rotten print. The terms will doubtless be hard. New entry. Heavens above, but the terms are crushing. All the U-boats to be surrendered. The High Seas Fleet interned. Why not say surrendered straight out? It will come to that, unless we blow them up in German ports. The end of Kaiserdom has come. We are virtually a republic. It is all like a dream. New entry. We have signed, and the last shot of the World War has been fired. Here everything is confusion. The saner elements are trying to keep order. The roughs are going round the dockyard in ships, looting freely. Better we should steal them than the English, and there is no government, so all is free, are two of their cries. There has been a little shooting in the streets, and it is not safe for officers to move about in uniform, though on the whole I have experienced little difficulty. I was summoned today before the local council, which is run by a man who was a petty officer of signals in the König. He recognized me and looked away. I was instructed to take U-122 over to Harwich for surrender to the English. I've made no difficulty. Someone has got to do it, and I verily believe I am indifferent to all emotions. We sail in convoy on the day after tomorrow. That is to say, if the crew condescend to fuel the boat in time. 3 looters were executed today in the dockyard, and this has had a steadying effect on the worst elements. New entry. I went on board 122 today, and on showing my authority, which was signed by the Council, which has now become the Council of Soldiers, Sailors, and Workmen, the crew of the boat held a meeting at which I was not invited to be present. At its conclusion the coxswain came up to me and informed me that a resolution had been carried by 17 votes to 10, to the effect that I was to be obeyed as captain of the boat. I begged him to convey to the crew my gratification, and expressed the hope that I should give satisfaction. I am afraid the sarcasm was quite lost on them. New entry. We are within 60 miles of Harwich, and I expect to sight the English cruisers any moment. I wrote some days ago that I was incapable of any emotion. I was wrong, as I have been so often during the last 2 years. In fact, I have come to the conclusion that I am no psychologist. I don't believe we Germans are any good at psychology, and that's the root reason why we failed. I do feel emotion. It's terrible. The shame, the humiliation is unbearable. I wonder how the English will behave. What a day of triumph for them. The signalman has just come down and reported British cruisers right ahead. It will soon be over. I must go up on deck and exercise my functions as elected captain of U-122 and representative of Germany in defeat. One last effort is demanded, and then. Note: this is the last sentence in the diary. It is probable that he suddenly had to hurry on deck and in the subsequent confusion forgot to rescue his diary from the locker in which he had thrust it.